fog clung to the pines like something alive the morning Eliza Corwin first saw the photograph. She had been alone in the archives, the kind of silence-filled stone building where dust seemed to breathe and every shuffled paper echoed too loudly. The photo shouldn't have stood out, just another stiffly posed family portrait from 1920, but the woman in the center drew Eliza's eye as though the image itself had been waiting for her. The woman's face was serene, almost too serene, her gaze tilted slightly past the camera as if she were listening to something no one else could hear. Her hands were folded neatly at her waist, fingers resting on an oval brooch pinned to her dress. At first glance it looked like simple metalwork, a dull ornament dulled further by age. But when Eliza leaned closer toward the magnifying lamp, a prickle crept up her arms. Inside the brooch, etched so finely it must have been invisible to the original photographer, was a symbol she couldn't place. Not geometric, not decorative. Something older. Something that felt wrong the more she stared at it. She zoomed in further. The symbol was not merely carved, it was layered, spiraling inward like a tunnel with no end. And in the deepest part of the spiral, barely visible, was a shape resembling an eye. Not a painted one, an eye looking back at her with a clarity that made her breath falter. The archive lights flickered. Eliza pulled back from the photograph, but the sense of being watched didn't fade. It followed her, sliding between the stacks of forgotten records and settling in the hollows of the room like a lingering whisper. Outside, beyond the frost-laced windows, the woods pressed against the town's edge in a dark, waiting mass. And somewhere in that stillness, Eliza felt, something had just awakened, because she had seen the brooch, because she had noticed the symbol. Because she was never meant to zoom in. The discovery begins in a dim, dust-laden archive room where the historian works alone, sorting through boxes that have not been disturbed in decades. The atmosphere is one of quiet neglect, the kind that settles over forgotten documents and brittle photographs that no one has cared to examine in generations. The historian approaches the task with routine focus, sifting through ledgers, aging letters, and faded newspaper clippings that all blur together in their stillness. Nothing in the room feels urgent or noteworthy until a single photograph slips loose from between two deteriorating scrapbooks, landing softly on the table as though demanding attention. The image is a sepia-toned portrait from 1920, ordinary in composition but strangely compelling. The historian almost moves past it, but something about the woman at the center holds their gaze. Her posture is formal, yet there is a subtle tension in the way she stands, as if caught between participating in the photograph and listening to something behind the camera. Her eyes do not meet the lens directly, they drift slightly to the side, filled with an unsettling calm that suggests she knows something the others in the image do not. Even the faint blur around the surrounding figures adds to the eerie effect, making her appear unusually sharp and present. The historian's attention shifts to the brooch pinned neatly at her collar. At first it appears to be an ordinary decorative piece, the kind commonly worn at the time. But the longer they look, the more it seems to resist the flatness of the photograph. Its metal glints in a way that makes it appear almost separate from the rest of the image, as if the camera captured it with unintended clarity. Intrigued, the historian places the photo beneath the magnifying lamp, expecting to find simple craftsmanship. Instead, the brooch reveals markings that are far too intricate for a casual accessory. Lines intersect and spiral with a deliberate structure, forming a pattern that feels intentional, almost ceremonial. The historian leans closer, sensing a faint unease rising beneath the curiosity. The symbol inside the brooch is not one they recognize, nor does it resemble any common design from the era. It feels older, out of place, and strangely aware of being observed. A chill moves through the historian's spine, not because of anything overtly threatening in the image, but because of the sudden impression that the photograph has been waiting, quietly and patiently, for someone to notice what others never did. The symbol discovered in the brooch begins to take on a life of its own when it starts appearing far beyond the confines of the photograph. At first, it's just a coincidence, or so the historian believes. While walking through the woods near the northern edge of the town, they notice a strange marking carved into the bark of an old pine tree. The lines are jagged but intentional, mimicking the spiral-like design seen in the brooch. It's crude and uneven, yet unmistakably similar. The sight creates a momentary freeze in the historian's movement, as if the forest itself has turned to listen. They brush it off as a random carving, perhaps made by teenagers or hikers, but the resemblance lingers like a splinter in the mind. A few days later, while visiting the site where the town's earliest settlers once lived, the historian spots another version of the symbol. This time it's drawn on a smooth, flat stone near a creek, the shape far more precise than the first. The symbol seems freshly etched, the grooves clean and pale against the darker rock. Its presence feels deliberate, as if someone wanted it to be found. The historian crouches beside the stone, tracing the air above it without daring to touch it, troubled by how its form echoes the design in the brooch with unsettling accuracy. A shiver crawls over the skin, not because of the cold creek water but because the pattern is beginning to appear where it has no logical reason to exist. Soon, more sightings follow. Arrangements of branches form the same spiral shape on the forest floor, the sticks laid out with too much precision to be accidental. Moss on a fallen log has been scraped away to reveal the symbol beneath, its edges careful and calculated. Each discovery feels like a message, though its meaning remains a void the historian cannot fill. What once seemed like random coincidence now feels like a growing presence saturating the woods, as though the forest has begun reflecting the brooch's hidden design back into the world. The townspeople remain oblivious or indifferent. Hunters chalk it up to bored kids, hikers assume it's part of some local folklore they've never heard of, and children, fascinated by the pattern, attempt to draw it without understanding the weight it carries. But for the historian, the repetition of the symbol gnaws at the edges of rational explanation. The woods, once familiar and benign, now feel charged with an unseen awareness. Each new marking seems to deepen the connection between the photograph and the present, suggesting that whatever the brooch once signified has not faded with time. Instead, it seems to be resurfacing, creeping quietly into the modern world through the silent, watchful trees of the northern forest. The woman in the photograph becomes more than just a face frozen in time when the historian begins digging into her identity. The archives hold almost nothing about her at first glance, just a name scribbled on the back of the photo in fading ink, barely legible, and a date that matches the year the portrait was taken. The historian, driven by a mix of curiosity and unease, combs through old census records, birth registries, and handwritten town logs. At first, the search feels fruitless, as if the woman resisted being remembered. But then a minor entry in a 1920 town almanac offers the first thread, a brief notation that she lived on the outskirts of town, near the dense woods that still loom over the present landscape. There is no mention of family, occupation, or age, only a line about her arrival in the town a few years prior, an arrival unaccompanied by any recorded past. Intrigued, the historian presses further and uncovers a thin file containing newspaper snippets from the era. One article stands out not for its length but for its eerie brevity. It mentions a local woman who disappeared without explanation, vanishing from her small cabin one fog-heavy morning. No witnesses, no signs of struggle, and no evidence of travel. Her name matches the one scrawled on the photograph. The date of her disappearance is listed as exactly 1 week after the portrait was taken. The sudden halt in her documented existence strikes the historian with a cold, sinking clarity. There were no follow-up investigations, no search parties, and no inquiries noted in the archives, as though the town collectively allowed her to slip from memory. This absence of concern feels unusual even for the early 20th century. The historian begins to wonder why her disappearance was met with silence. The photograph now feels heavier in their hands, as if carrying the weight of something deliberately overlooked. As they continue searching through the archives, they find sporadic mentions of people who claim to have seen her after her disappearance, never detailed, always dismissed as mistakes or superstition. A woodsman wrote in his journal about glimpsing a woman in outdated clothing wandering between the pines but was ridiculed by neighbors until he stopped speaking of it. The historian senses a pattern not of coincidence but of willful erasure, a quiet, collective forgetting that hints at fear rather than indifference. The more they uncover, the more the woman's quiet gaze in the photograph transforms. It no longer seems serene, it seems knowing, as if she were aware that her existence would be swallowed by the town's silence, leaving only this single image behind as a reluctant witness to her fate. Patterns begin to emerge only after the historian broadens their search beyond the single 1920 portrait. What starts as a focused inquiry into one woman's disappearance soon evolves into something far stranger when more photographs from different decades surface. At first, the additional images seem unrelated, individuals from separate families, different social circles, even different towns. Yet in each photograph, there is a person positioned almost casually within the frame who wears the same brooch. Sometimes it is pinned at the collar, other times it rests nearer the shoulder or sits inconspicuously among other accessories. The historian doesn't notice the connection immediately. It becomes clear only after hours of sorting, scanning, and enlarging old images, when a nagging familiarity in the shape of the ornament catches their eye again and again. The brooch is unmistakable once recognized. The intricate lines, the subtle spiral, the faint impression of an eye at the center, it is identical across every photograph despite the images ranging from the early 1900s to the 1950s. Each wearer is different: a young schoolteacher, a stern-looking farmer, a girl of no more than 12 posing with her family, a traveling salesman captured in a group portrait outside a general store. None of them share obvious connections, and none of the archival notes reference the brooch as a significant possession. What is most chilling, however, is the recurring fact that every individual who wears it vanishes from local records shortly after the photograph is taken. The patterns of disappearance vary in detail but align in outcome: no confirmed sightings afterward, no documented deaths, and no subsequent mentions in community logs or newspapers. They simply dissolve from recorded history. The historian begins cross-referencing census data, personal letters, and town registries, hoping to find some mundane explanation that might connect these people. But the more they investigate, the emptier the trail becomes. It's as if each wearer was quietly erased, their lives allowed to proceed normally until the moment the camera captured them with the brooch pinned to their clothing. After that, their trail fades into nothing. The archivist starts to feel the weight of a disturbing pattern forming, one that suggests intentionality rather than coincidence. The brooch seems to arrive in the photographs like a silent signature, marking its wearer not with pride or memory but with absence. This repeated vanishing acts as a grim echo of the first woman's disappearance, but seeing it happen across decades turns unease into dread. The historian realizes that the brooch is not just a curious artifact, it is a constant, moving quietly through time, choosing new hosts, leaving only a photograph as the last trace of each person who wore it. The story of the brooch and its vanished wearers takes an even darker turn when the historian encounters the account of a reclusive hunter living near the deep northern stretch of the forest. His reputation in town is mixed: some call him eccentric, others claim he sees things no one else does, but his familiarity with the woods is unmatched. The historian approaches him reluctantly, unsure what he might know, yet hoping for any lead that could explain the growing pattern of disappearances tied to the brooch. When asked about strange occurrences in the woods, the hunter listens in silence, his weathered face tight with a hesitation that suggests he has been waiting for someone to ask the right question. It doesn't take long before he begins to speak of a figure he has seen walking through the trees at dusk. He describes her as a woman dressed in clothing that hasn't been worn in decades: long skirt, high collar, sleeves buttoned to the wrist. Her silhouette moves with a measured grace, almost gliding rather than stepping, and she never seems to notice the snapping twigs or shifting shadows around her. The hunter admits that at first he thought she was a reenactor or a lost hiker dressed strangely, but each time he saw her, she looked exactly the same, as if unchanged by time or weather. Her face remained pale, her expression distant, and the brooch on her chest gleamed even under minimal light. The historian's breath catches when the hunter describes the brooch's spiral pattern with surprising precision. He recalls the way it seemed to draw the eye, catching light unnaturally as though it had its own faint glow. He explains that sometimes he glimpsed her standing between the trunks, still as a statue, watching something the hunter could never see. Other times, she would disappear the moment he blinked, leaving only an unnatural quiet behind. Though deeply familiar with the forest, he admits these encounters rattled him in a way nothing else had. He eventually stopped venturing near the northern paths at dusk, believing the woman was not a flesh-and-blood wanderer but something tethered to the woods themselves. The historian listens with growing dread as the hunter recounts a final detail that cements the connection to the 1920 photograph. He insists the woman looks exactly like the figure from that old portrait: same face, same posture, same haunting calm. When he once attempted to approach her, she turned her head slowly in his direction, yet her eyes didn't meet his. They looked past him, as if she were waiting for someone else entirely. The hunter's voice trembles slightly as he admits that she has never aged, never spoken, and never left the forest's shadowed grasp, lingering like an echo of a life abruptly stolen from time. The brooch's unsettling journey through time becomes even more disturbing when the historian begins researching symbols that resemble the one etched into its metal surface. At first, the search moves through predictable academic channels, catalogues of known cultural motifs, references to local indigenous art, European heraldry, and early settler insignias. Yet nothing matches. The design in the brooch diverges from every documented pattern, refusing to settle into any category of known symbolism. This absence of cultural origin shouldn't be alarming, but it carries an eerie implication. Symbols usually belong to stories, traditions, or beliefs. This one feels like it belongs to something that exists outside the boundaries of recorded history. The breakthrough comes unexpectedly while examining an obscure text in the town library's restricted section, a brittle volume written by a traveling ethnographer in the late 1800s. The book is filled with accounts of rural folklore, superstitions, and rituals whispered among isolated settlements. Buried in a chapter about a now-lost community that once lived near the northern woods, a crude drawing catches the historian's eye. Though clumsily sketched, the spiral shape and central eye are unmistakable. The ethnographer describes it as a mark associated with a secretive group rumored to guard their forested territory with rituals designed to maintain the presence of a watcher or sentinel figure. The group is said to have believed that the forest was a living entity requiring an intermediary, someone bound to both the woods and their people, able to perceive dangers unseen by ordinary eyes. This intermediary, the watcher, was chosen through a ritual involving an object of metal inscribed with the group's emblem. Though the ethnographer provides no clear details about how one became the watcher, he hints that the selection was irreversible, binding the chosen person to the woods in ways that seemed both symbolic and literal. Most townspeople dismissed the group as nothing more than a fringe cult, but the ethnographer's descriptions suggest their beliefs were deeply rooted, and their practices feared. As the historian reads further, a quiet dread settles in. The brooch appears to be more than a piece of jewelry. It is an artifact of this forgotten group, a relic connected to a ritual meant to designate a person who would never fully belong to the world again. The idea that the brooch might have been passed across generations, not as an heirloom but as a binding mark, casts a chilling new light on the repeated disappearances. If the brooch chose its wearer, then each person in the photographs may have been claimed by an ancient tradition that never entirely vanished, lingering in the woods and waiting for its next rightful bearer. The historian's investigation eventually leads them into the forest itself, driven by a mixture of fear, curiosity, and a desperate need to understand the connection between the brooch, the vanished individuals, and the strange symbol reappearing across the landscape. The woods have always loomed large at the edge of the town, but now they feel different, alive, listening, as if aware of being trespassed upon. As the historian follows the faint traces left behind by the symbol, each marking seems to guide them deeper, forming a subtle path between the trees. Branches bend unnaturally overhead, filtering the daylight into shifting patterns that resemble the spiraled eye of the brooch. Even the air feels heavier, muffled, absorbing every sound until the historian's footsteps become the only rhythm in the forest's hush. Hours pass with no sign of another person, yet the sensation of being watched intensifies. At times the historian catches glimpses of movement between the pines, a silhouette too still to be an animal, a flicker of fabric the color of old photographs, a shape vanishing just as they try to refocus. The forest floor grows uneven, the roots twisting like veins beneath their feet, guiding them toward a part of the woods few locals dare to enter. Stories once dismissed as folk tales now feel like warnings, accounts of lights flickering between trees, whispers that echoed with no source, and figures that walked without disturbing the leaves. At last, the historian reaches a clearing unlike any seen before. The trees encircle the space with unnatural precision, forming a perfect boundary that seems crafted rather than organic. In the center, etched deep into the earth, is the symbol, the full spiral with the hollowed eye at its core. The lines are too exact to be carved by hand, as though the ground had shaped itself into the pattern. The soil within the symbol is darker than the surrounding earth, as if shadowed even under the weak daylight. A strange warmth pulses faintly from the center, radiating like a slow heartbeat rising from below. As the historian steps closer, the atmosphere shifts. The forest grows utterly still, the air thickening with a presence that feels both ancient and expectant. Then, emerging from the line of trees at the clearing's edge, stands the woman from the 1920 photograph. She appears exactly as she did in the image, unchanged, untouched by time, her dress crisp despite decades, her posture poised with the same unsettling calm. The brooch glints at her collar, catching the dim light with an unnatural gleam. Her eyes drift past the historian, not meeting their gaze but settling on the symbol carved into the earth, as though she has been waiting patiently for someone to finally follow the trail to its end.